Good evening. I'm Heather Campion, the CEO of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you, along with my colleague in the front row, Tom Putnam, who's the director of the library, to welcome you to this national treasure. It's one of only 13 presidential libraries in America, and it's our nation's memorial to one of America's most admired presidents. As you may have noticed, we've just completed a renovation of our museum downstairs, and we hope you'll come back to see it. It has new technologies, including interactive displays and beautifully remastered films where you can see President Kennedy delivering some of his most iconic speeches on big HD screens. It's been designed for those who never knew President Kennedy to experience him in a whole new way. So we hope you'll come back. Here in our forum, we've also recently introduced new technologies to enable people all over the world to view these forum programs, which are now being live streamed and made available on our website, as well as through all of our social media channels. And this is thanks to generous support from our leading sponsor, Bank of America, and we're very pleased, I don't see her yet, she's probably stuck in traffic, to have, she'll be here tonight, Ann Finucane, who's Bank of America's Global Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer, a member of the Kennedy Library Foundation's Board of Directors, and the magical force behind our moderator this evening, her husband, Mike Barnicle. I also want to thank our other sponsors, the Boston Foundation, the Lowell Institute, and Viacom, as well as our media partners, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. I also want to take a moment to introduce a very special guest whom we're honored to have here this evening, Vicki Kennedy. You know, this library is dedicated to the memory of our 35th president, who was also the godfather to our beloved longtime Senator, Edward M. Kennedy. It's hard to imagine what this institution would be without the decades of care and attention that Senator Kennedy gave to this memorial, and this is in no small part thanks to Vicki's own energy, talent, and support, which enabled him to give us all so much. Thanks to Vicki, we also now have an exciting new neighbor next door, the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, which is already bringing thousands of new visitors to Columbia Point, so we hope you'll get a chance to visit that as well. As we begin tonight's forum, it's worth noting that today, over 80% of people in the world have no living memory of President Kennedy. But this evening, we're especially fortunate to have two speakers who not only remember him, but who were profoundly influenced by him. We're here to discuss David Axelrod's new book, right here, My 40 Years in Politics, copies of which are on sale in our museum store, and David will be signing them after the forum outside in the hall. I'd like to quote the very first line of his book. He writes, "Not everyone can point to a moment, the exact time and place when a lifelong passion began. I can." As David goes on to describe, it was just 12 days before the presidential election in 1960 when he saw John F. Kennedy speak in his neighborhood of Stuyvesant Town, New York. And although he was just 5 years old, he claims to have listened to the candidate in rapt attention, along with the rest of the crowd. But nevertheless, what he remembers is a scene that he describes as, quote, pure magic, electric, and important. It was then that he knew he would have a life in politics. He then became, in his own words, obsessed with President Kennedy, imitating his signature Boston accent. And perhaps, Mike, you can get David to share that with this crowd of Bostonians tonight. David began his career in journalism, another passion of President Kennedy's, at the Chicago Tribune, and at the age of 27, was the youngest political writer in the paper's history. But after 8 years of reporting, he left the paper to pursue a career as a campaign strategist, and in less than 6 months, he had already led a successful campaign that helped Congressman Paul Simon win a surprise seat in the United States Senate. And the rest, as they say, is history. In the 4 decades since, David has advised over 150 local, state, and national campaigns, culminating, as we all know, with his leading role in the historic presidential election of Barack Obama in 2008 and again in 2012. Here at President Kennedy's library, we witness each day President Kennedy's many gifts to the future, and David Axelrod is most certainly one of them. Over 50 years after the moment when he was inspired by John F. Kennedy's historic campaign for the presidency, David Axelrod led one himself, serving, as he has said, as Barack Obama's keeper of the message and of the idealistic flame, and helping to elect America's first African-American president. It was a campaign like the one he witnessed in 1960 that inspired young people to turn out in droves and urged Americans to join together to build a future that was bright, with the memorable phrase that David came up with himself, "Yes, we can." Joining us to ensure that not only do we hear a good imitation of David's Boston accent, but that we also have an entertaining and enlightening evening is veteran print and broadcast journalist Mike Barnicle. Mike is no stranger to Bostonians. A native of Massachusetts, he grew up with John F. Kennedy as his senator and later worked as an aide in Robert F. Kennedy's 1968 presidential campaign. And as Robert Redford reminded us here in this forum recently, Mike's career should also be noted for the role he played early on in his career in Redford's film, The Candidate, back in 1972. Here in Boston, Mike is best known for becoming, over the course of 3 decades, a prominent voice in New England and the most read columnist in the Boston Globe. His gift for capturing the fabric of this city and its people is legendary still. He's written more than 4,000 newspaper columns and continues to write for Time, Newsweek, the Daily Beast, the Huffington Post. We could go on. And as we all know, he's now a staple on MSNBC as a regular contributor and occasional host on both Morning Joe and Hardball with Chris Matthews. Please join me in welcoming this evening both David Axelrod and Mike Barnicle. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you.
All right. So are you uncomfortable enough with the sun in your eyes? Because that's the way we want it.
Yeah, I know. I thought this was some sort of interrogation technique.
Yeah.
So before you start, I got 3 things I got to say.
Okay.
First of all, I think the last time I was in this room was for a memorial service for Senator Kennedy, and was one of the most moving events that I can remember, in part because of the bipartisan expressions of appreciation for him, and it made you realize all over again what he meant to this country. And I just toured the EMK Institute. I hope everybody here does that because it's a remarkable place, and it does remind you that there's nobility in this work. So I'm so honored that Vicki's here. I've done countless book events. They've all been great, but this one I had circled on my calendar because of what JFK meant to me, and I'm going to stick to the rules and not say it in full until the end unless he forces me to. And then last, I want to say what an honor it is to be with Mike Barnicle. You know, part of my book is about my career in journalism, and I grew up in New York, and I was an inveterate reader of Jimmy Breslin and Pete Hamill and the great columnists of that day. And when I moved to Chicago, there was Mike Royko, who was a towering figure in Chicago journalism. And Mike Barnicle is very much in that line, one of the great big city columnists of our lifetime. So for him to be here today with me is really an honor. And that's not just my way of getting him to ease up on me in these questions. I know what he's thinking. So. Okay, now.
Yeah, well, it's not going to happen that I'm going to ease up.
No, I knew that.
So David, let me get right to the point right away. What's your favorite color?
Of all the things I prepared for, that was...
When you were 5 years of age in Stuyvesant Town at that rally, your journalism background, did you take notes that day?
I didn't, and people ask me that a lot because I write about a lot of memories that go back a long time, and people say, well, how do you remember those things? And I think, there are many, many things I don't remember, and I guess the things that you remember are the things that are foundational, the things that so stick with you that you carry them with you for the rest of your life. And I was there, and my sister Joan is sitting right here in the front row. She was at that same rally, and she can affirm everything that was there in the book. But I had a kid working with me, Tim Skozik, who he's not a kid, he's a man, but he was a kid when we started. I think they were dog years working on this book with me, so he's now an old man. But he was the researcher, and I think he was surprised in going back and sort of fact-checking some of my stories that they kind of checked out. And, including we got a picture of that rally in Stuyvesant Town. It was pretty much as I remembered it because it was such a vivid memory, which I can't share with you now because I promised to wait until the end of the program to talk about it.
The book, for those of you who have not read it, I would urge you to reread it. For those of you who have not yet purchased it, I would urge you to purchase it because unlike most political memoirs or autobiographies, it is filled with both insight and vulnerability, perspective and personality, and parts of it read like a novel. It's a terrific read. I want you to reference one point for the people here tonight. In the book, there came a moment in time when a very young Barack Obama, prior to being elected president of the United States, you came away from something that had happened with him, that he did, and you said to yourself, or maybe to your wife, Susan, I'm a believer. That's the title, Believer. Explain that.
Well, there were, you learn about someone along the way. I'm going to back into this answer because I'm not quite sure which point you're referring to, but I think I know. But, I had met Barack Obama in 1992. A friend of mine called me, a woman named Betty Lou Saltzman, who's kind of a doyenne of liberal politics in Chicago, and she said, I just met the most extraordinary young man, just got back from Harvard Law School, and I think you ought to meet him. And I said, I'm happy to meet anybody you want to, Betty Lou, but why? She said, I think he could be the first African-American president of the United States. So as you can imagine, Mike, being a guy who's familiar with sports, whenever I go to the track, I take Betty Lou with me now. I met him, and we had lunch, and I didn't, as I said in the book, leave humming Hail to the Chief, but I did sense that he was an unusual guy because he had been president of the Harvard Law Review, and he came back to Chicago. He could have written his ticket at any law firm or corporation in America and came back instead to run a voter registration drive and practice law at a small civil rights firm. And as he talked about the possibility of a career in politics, he talked about it through the eyes of someone who saw it as a calling and not a business, who wanted to do things and not just be something. And that impressed me. But I didn't work for him until 10 years after that. He had been in the state Senate. He had lost a race in 2000. Narrowly for Congress by 30 points.
To Bobby Rush.
And to Bobby Rush, yeah. It was kind of crushing. And in 2002, he and I were both going through this existential experience. He, because he had lost this race and had one foot out the door of politics, and me, because a former client of mine, who you mentioned before we walked out here, a fellow some of you may have heard of named Rod Blagojevich, was... I must tell you, I've traveled all over the country. It always engenders the same reaction. Rod, I had worked for him for Congress. I kind of liked him. He was a feisty guy, neighborhood guy. And he went to Congress. Then he came to me and said he wanted to run for governor. And, Congress is one thing. You're one of 435. How badly can you screw it up? But governor was a real job. And I said to him, I said to him, well, why do you want to be governor? And he said, well, you can help me figure that out. And I said, look, if I have to help you figure it out, you shouldn't run. And that was the end of our relationship. By the summer of 2002, it was clear he was going to win. I mean, he ran a state-of-the-art campaign, ran as a reformer, because as you remember, our last governor went to prison also. So,
Well, you're about 4 out of
painting
7 in terms of governors going.
Yeah, yes. Not, the land of Lincoln is not doing well right now. And we don't have a great record on this. But he was going to, and he ran on a no tax pledge in a state that was clearly headed for fiscal problems. And so I thought, gee, this business has become too cynical for me to keep on doing this work. And so I was going through my own existential crisis, and Obama called me and said, I got one race left in me. I told Michelle if I lose, I'll go out and make a living. And he said, and I think I'm going to run for the Senate. And he was not a frontline candidate. He was like a third-tier candidate. Everybody respected him, thought he was a brilliant guy, but he had just lost this big loss for Congress and had no money. He had this name, Barack Obama. 1 year after a guy named Osama bin Laden had taken out the World Trade Center. So there was a lot of doubt about him. But I said to my wife, Susan, if I could help Barack get elected to the United States Senate, that would be something I could be proud of for the rest of my life. And so we went around and tried to, with a little tin cup, trying to persuade people that he could win. But I learned 3 things about him in that campaign. The first was in 2002, in October 2002. We hadn't had formalized our relationship yet, but the Senate was voting on the Iraq War resolution. And the same Betty Lou invited him to speak at an anti-war rally. We had a call because every other candidate was for the resolution, including the Democrats, because it was quite popular, as you remember. And Obama said, well, and there were some people on the call who thought he shouldn't go, too risky and so on. And Obama said, you know what, I think this is a bad idea, and I think I'm against this resolution. I'm going to go to this rally. I didn't think that much of it because it was a small rally, 1,000 people, wasn't covered much. And it was only after the fact that I saw what he had jotted down to say there. And he said, I believe that if we go, we're going to be committing ourselves to a war of undetermined length, undetermined cost, undetermined consequences, that we're going to unleash sectarian warfare and strife that can't be controlled, and that we're going to make America more of a fulcrum for extremism, all of which was true, all of which we're still living with today. The second thing I learned about him, and I'm wending I know you're sitting there thinking, when is he going to answer my question? But I'm getting there. He, early in that campaign, traveled to Southern Illinois, and as you know, you get down to Southern Illinois, you're closer to Little Rock than Chicago, and he went to a veterans, a small veterans hall there and met with some people. And the kid who traveled with him called me and said, gee, we just had a great event here. And I thought, really? And when Obama called me that night, I said, I heard you had a really good event. And he said, why are you so surprised? I said, I don't know, black guy named Barack Obama in deep Southern Illinois. I thought it could be challenging. He said, you don't get it. These people are like my grandparents from Kansas. And I talk about my grandfather marching in Patton's army. My grandmother's a Rosie the Riveter. And he said, we get along great. And I realized at that moment that this was a guy who felt comfortable with himself and comfortable in any room in which he walked, whether it was a veterans hall in downstate Illinois or a church in the inner city of Chicago or a Tony parlor in the suburbs. And that was an extraordinary quality. And then the third thing I learned in that campaign was when we finagled and we did finagle it, the keynote speech right here in Boston. And we had been working behind the scenes to try and get that assignment. He finally got the call. We were driving around in rural Illinois, bad phone connection, but Mary Beth Cahill, John Kerry's manager, called and said, we want you to give the keynote speech. He accepted. He hung up. He said, I know what I want to say. I said, what do you want to say? He said, I want to wrap my story up in the larger American story, and I want to talk about that. And he's traveling around the state for the next few weeks, jotting notes down the whole time. He was still in the state Senate, and he'd go into the men's room at the state Senate, jotting down notes in between votes. And he finally pulled it all together, and Susan and I were on vacation, we were in Europe for a week, and we got this fax. He had sent this at 1 in the morning, which is generally when, that's on the early side for an Obama speech to arrive. Usually it's in the middle of the night. And and I'm reading page 1, page 2. By page 3, I said, this is going to be one of the great convention speeches of all time. And when he gave it, I was on the floor here at the Fleet Center, and I watched the reaction people were having. And I had been on the floor when Mario Cuomo gave his speech in 1984, and I thought, I turned to Robert Gibbs, my buddy who was the press secretary, and I said, this guy's life just changed forever, and maybe ours did too. And that's the way it worked. By the next day, he was swarmed by people. But you learn about people in campaigns, not just when things are good, but especially when things were bad. And in 2008, when we were running, and the Reverend Wright story broke, I learned a lot about him then. You remember there was a compendium of Reverend Wright's greatest hits over a series of years, you know, the most vicious thing. And some were taken out of context, and of course there were many sermons that were much different than that. But taken together, they were quite alarming. And you know, everybody was waiting for the president, for Senator Obama to get tripped up by this issue of race. People didn't believe in our country enough to believe that a guy, an African-American guy, could actually get elected president. And so this was raging on cable television all day long, and it was leading the news, and the Senate was in session, so he was kind of insulated from it. Senate was in session till like 1 or 2 in the morning. He came back to Chicago the next day. We had editorial board meetings on another issue, Tony Rezko, which we don't have to, but a challenging issue for him as well. And then he did some cable TV because he wanted to respond to the right thing, and the questions were so tough and so pointed. He called David Plouffe, the campaign manager, and I that night, and he said, I want to give a speech about race. And he had been wanting to do this for some time. So, but I want to talk about Reverend Wright in the context of race in our country and in our politics. And he said, and this was Friday. He said, I want to do it no later than Tuesday morning because I don't want this to fester. And he said, and I have to write it. And I said, well, but you're campaigning all day tomorrow. We've got a film shoot on Sunday we have to do. And then we're campaigning all day in Pennsylvania on Monday. He said, don't worry about it. I know what I want to say. Just set it up. So we reserved the Constitution Center in Philadelphia for Tuesday morning on the theory that if you're going to go out on a big stage. And Saturday night after the campaign, he dictates an outline to John Favreau, his speechwriter. He sends back a rough draft. Sunday after the shoot and after his kids go to sleep, he starts working on this speech. Finishes about half of it at about 2 or 3 in the morning, and then we leave at 8 for Pennsylvania. Campaigns all day in Pennsylvania. We get to the hotel, I headed for the bar, and he headed for his room. And in the bar where all these reporters would come to see whether this was the end of Obama. And about 2 in the morning, I wake up and I look at my BlackBerry, and there's the speech completed. And I'm scrolling through it in the dark. And, when I finished, I emailed him back saying, this is why you should be president. The next because it was such a powerful statement and such a personal, powerful piece. And the next morning, we're at the Constitution Center. A lot of his friends were in the first few rows, very tense. There were places overrun with press. This was going to be taken live on all the cable stations. And we're standing in the green room, and he says to me, he said, I'm going to go out there and make this speech, and either people will accept it or they won't. But if they don't, And if they don't, he said, then I won't be president. He said, but at least I'll have said what I think needs to be said. He said, and that's worth something. And he strode out there and he gave the speech. And these are the times when you see whether someone is up to it. Now, I don't know whether this was the example this is a heck of a time to ask, I guess. 10 minutes into my answer. But,
10 minutes?
Well, who's counting?
Well, David, thank you very much for
Yes.
joining us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, good night.
What can
Thank
I
you
say?
for coming.
You pried all of this out of me with your first question.
Well, let me see if I can bring something else out of you. First
Okay.
of all, the two people you referenced, the young aide with him down in southern Illinois, scratch golfer,
Right, yes.
okay?
Yes, David Katz was his name.
Yeah, so I mean, that was a predilection of things to come. And Johnny Favreau, the
Yes.
speechwriter,
Yes,
Who-
pride of New
who-
England.
Holy Cross graduate, who is entrusted with the awful
Yes,
task
yes.
of going to him in 2004,
Yes,
prior to
yes.
his delivery of the convention speech, and extracting a line that then candidate Barack Obama for the Senate. was
Yes, yes, yes. So,
15 minutes at a minimum.
So John Favreau was like an intern on the speech writing staff of John Kerry at the time, and Obama had worked, he had worked day and night on this speech, and it was really a thing of beauty. And he had one passage that ended with this crescendo, and it was all about, it was in the vein of not being a country of red states and blue states, but it finished with us. All of us pledging allegiance to the red, white, and blue. And I'm not doing it justice now, but it was very poetic the way he built to it and so on. And this very frightened, I would say, young man came up, and he had known Gibbs because Gibbs had worked briefly for Kerry. And he said, and he explained what was going on, and Gibbs helpfully said, well, go in there and tell him. So poor Favreau goes and says, Senator, there's a bit of a problem. It turns out that Senator Kerry had the same exact line in his speech.
Maybe.
Well,
But he did
it was
later.
not maybe in Obama's mind, because when Favreau left, he said, I can't believe they're stealing my line. And he was just incensed about that. I love that line, he said. And I said, well, they're giving us, a chance to talk to 18 million people, so maybe we ought to call it even. So like a year later, or half a year later, Gibbs brought Favreau in as our speechwriter in the Senate office, and mercifully and incredibly, Obama didn't remember that he was the guy who delivered that message. One other thing on the scratch golfer, during that campaign, I would speak to Obama a lot, particularly in the evening, and I called him on something, and he said, can I call you back? Katz and I are on the golf course, and we're playing for money. So I call him back, and I say, I am for you because, this is in 2004, I'm for you because I thought you were the smartest guy in the race. I said, but you're playing a scratch golfer for money? He said, don't be ridiculous. We're taking some money from my colleagues. He's on my team.
So, David, in the course of your career, first of all, you do the unusual today. You go from journalism to politics. The media landscape is rife with people who've gone from politics to journalism lately. But in the course of your career, people you've helped run for office, win or lose, there's always been one sort of strain through all of them. They wanted to do the right thing. And there's a certain still, and this is of benefit to you, it's a compliment to you, a certain naivete to you in terms of what you expect of people who run for public office. So the question is there a difference in your mind, and if there is, I'm sure you'll tell us all, between public policy and politics?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, in fairness, because I just fessed up to the Blagojevich thing, I can't say that every single one of them lived up to those
But you
standards.
didn't know that then.
No, right. And I have, I think there, my friends tease me that I have the ability make myself fall in love with the guy or gal I'm working for, and hopefully, or you may say naively, fit them into my notion of what public servants should be, what politicians should be. But there is this chord that runs. I left journalism to work for Paul Simon, another former journalist, and he was an exemplary guy. And I went back, Mike, and I looked at the ads I did for him when he ran for president in 1988, and the tagline to those ads was, "Isn't it time to believe again?" This notion of believers, my book's called Believer, is very much about people who believe that public service is a calling and an opportunity to grab the wheel of history and steer it in the right direction, make a difference for communities and the country and for people. And I gravitated to folks who had that point of view, and not just Democrats, by the way. When I was, I did my first campaign when I was 9 for Bobby Kennedy when he ran for the Senate in New York. I wasn't the strategist. I was just handing out leaflets then. The next year,
you weren't his driver, though.
No. And the next year, I broke with the Democratic Party in New York. It was a big decision for me at the age of 10 to do that. But I thought that the candidate that the party was running, who was Abe Beame, was a kind of a hack. And so I worked for John Lindsay, who many of you may remember. He's who was a liberal Republican, and I'm sure you have like a field museum here or something where they have some of those on display, where you can look. But he shared that kind of big vision of what we could do through politics and through government. To your question, I think that you have to get elected first of all, and there are compromises that one must make. There's no doubt about it in the process of getting elected. There are compromises one has to make in the interest of governing, and the important thing is that you know where the lines are. If winning elections is the ultimate goal, then everything is fungible. You're willing to compromise on anything. But if you have higher goals, then you know those things on which you can and can't compromise. So I don't, I was critical of the president in this way in my book, in the sense that he has too little patience for people who run for office and think that winning is the most important thing. He has too little patience for that, and you can't be that. I mean, I told the story in this book about him going over to talk to the Democratic caucus on the Senate side about the health care bill. And he gave a great speech. It was a completely off-the-record session, one of the great off-the-cuff speeches I'd ever heard him give. We get back in the car, and he's looking out the window, driving back to the White House, and he says, what are they all so afraid of? And I'm like, well, I think they're afraid of losing their jobs. And he says, well, what's the point of being up here for 30 years if you never do anything? And I said, well, you can say that because, as you once told me, being Barack Obama is not a bad gig in and of itself. So, but for a lot of these guys and gals, this is the best job they'll ever have, and they don't want to lose it. And they want to do good things, but if it's a choice between doing good things and being here, I think they're going to choose being here.
Did you show the president a copy of your book before it was published?
No. No, in fact, I waited until it was in print because I didn't want to leave anything to chance. I didn't want to put him in that position, and I didn't want to put myself in that position.
Did he read it, and did he copy it?
Oh, yes.
Yeah?
He
What
read
did he
it.
say?
I must tell you, one of the most anxiety-producing moments that I had in this whole project was when the White House operator called, and I knew he had the book for several days, and the White House operator called in the middle of the day, which is pretty unusual. Usually I hear from him at night. And she said, do you have a moment for the president?
No.
Which is always I said to him once, does anybody ever say no when they get a, he said, just John Boehner. But he got on the phone and he said, well, I've read your book. And then there's this long silence. And I'm like, oh my God, what's going to come next? And he said, I think you've done a fine job. He says, I just got 3 things that, and then he listed the things that bothered him. And they were relatively small, so I was relieved.
Well, let me ask you about one of the things that perhaps may have bothered him. And there are several references to this throughout the book. And it is the relationship, sometimes a dicey relationship, between people like Rahm Emanuel, Robert Gibbs, and reading between the lines, I think sometimes you and Valerie Jarrett. And there are a couple of specific references in the book to Valerie Jarrett and Michelle Obama at one point urging you to remove Robert Gibbs from the campaign before the campaign really
In 2000,
began.
that was in 2000, really late 2006, right when we were about to start the campaign.
Was he upset about any aspect of those passages?
Well, I shouldn't share what he was and
he
wasn't
was.
upset about. No. You shouldn't surmise that. But if I start answering those questions, then I have to answer other questions. Let's leave it there. But move on, will you?
Thanks for the answer. Where was I going here? I mean, I had a couple of. I'll leave you alone on that. There is in my world, which used to be your world, and is still, I think, part of your world. A feeling, a strong feeling I have always had that very few things are more interesting in terms of covering a story, writing a story, than what I call the loser's locker room. Everybody gravitates toward a winner. What was Barack Obama like on the night he lost to Bobby Rush? What was he like on the evening that he lost to Hillary Clinton in New Hampshire? What did you glean from that?
Again, this goes to the point I was making. First of all, I wasn't involved in the Rush campaign, so I can't speak to how he handled that. I can only surmise that he handled it in much the same way. You know, we were absolutely confident that we were going to win the New Hampshire primary. Our theory was that if, you know, the Iowa caucuses were just 5 days before the New Hampshire primary, and the momentum from the Iowa caucuses would carry forward, all the polling reflected that. And we approached New Hampshire like a conquering army. You know, we came in there and we basically did victory laps. And, you know, there were big crowds, and he waved from the podium. And Hillary Clinton, who had been campaigning from the podium for a year, now was at ground level. Really, it was pretty apparent that she was now had thrown caution to the wind, and she was connecting with people in a much more visceral way. Her vulnerabilities were clear. She seemed like a more approachable person, and her sense of advocacy was clear. And so, you know, all of a sudden there was role reversal. She was the sort of, she was the plucky insurgent, and we were the big, you know, dirigible waiting to be shot down. And we had a bad debate that Saturday night in which Obama made a mistake, an offhanded remark that seemed to be slighting of Hillary, uncharacteristic of him. And that Monday, we're riding around.
You're likable enough?
Yeah. And we're riding around New Hampshire in an RV on Monday, and someone said, hey, we just got word Hillary broke down. And, you know, there were some people who thought, well, this is terrible for her and so on. But the video soon appeared on the internet, and we saw it. And he and I both had the same reaction. You know, she looks pretty sympathetic. She looks pretty compelling, pretty real. And neither of us were very. So our heads were telling us, hey, we can't lose this. We had all this momentum. But you get a gut when you've been in this business for a long time. And I mean, you develop a big gut, which I did as well. But I mean, you have a feel for this. And nobody felt particularly good, but we thought we could hang on. And then the votes started coming in, and we saw some precincts from Manchester that were way off of what we needed. And it became clear over time that we weren't going to win. So Gibbs and Plouffe and I, David Plouffe, our manager, had to go up and tell Obama, who was alone with Michelle having dinner in their suite. So
in Manchester, New Hampshire?
We were in
Dinner?
we were in Nashua. We were in Nashua.
Was he okay after that?
I don't know where they flew the meal in from. Maybe it came up from Boston. But we didn't. We were courageous enough to give him the news, but we didn't want to give it to him in front of Michelle. So we knocked on the door.
Why not?
We didn't know how she would, she was a civilian. We didn't know how she would take it, you know. So he came out into the hallway, and he knew right away, you know, the fact that we were summoning him into the hallway was not good news. And Pluff said, well, looks like we're going to be a couple of points short. And Obama said, what do you think happened? And we go through all of that. And he leaned against the wall, and he kind of smiled wanly, and, or is it wanly?
Wanly.
Thank you. And I'm a print guy. Yeah. I'm not a big broadcaster.
So am I.
So, and he said, this is going to go on for a while, isn't it? And he kind of, and then the next morning we drove to Boston. We were going to have a fundraiser here that was going to be a big victory fundraiser. And everybody was stunned by the result. And he hadn't slept much. It was apparent on the way down. He'd been thinking about the whole thing. And he got up in front of this group, and some of them, some folks may have been, were you there? Yeah, Carol Fulp was there, one of our great early supporters. And he said, you know, I've been thinking about this. He said, and I know this sounds strange, but I think this was meant to be. He said, we were a little like Icarus, flying too close to the sun. And he said, this isn't how change happens. It's not this easy. He said, you got to fight for it. And we got to get back to ground level here. And we got to make the case. And let me tell you why it's important. And then he gave this stem-winding speech about why, what we were fighting for. And by the end, everybody was up on their feet and cheering. And I saw this quality again and again in that campaign, where every time we had a setback, I mean, we lost the Texas and Ohio primary where we had a chance to finish the nominating fight. And he called a meeting the next day, and he came in. We didn't know whether he was going to clean house. We didn't know what he was going to do. And he came in with this yellow legal pad. He always had a bunch of notes that he'd thought through. And he started off by saying, I can think of a dozen things that I could have done better in the last few weeks. And he said, I bet everybody in this room can as well. He said, so I'm not here to fix blame. I'm here to figure out what went wrong so that we can make adjustments moving forward. We had a very good discussion for a couple of hours. And he got up to leave, and he's walking out, and he says, now, I want you guys to understand, I'm not yelling at you. And he started walking out further, and he turned around and said, of course, after blowing $20 million in 2 weeks, I could yell at you. He said, but I'm not yelling at you. And he walked out. Of course, everybody in that room would have run through a wall for the guy because of that and a million other things. But the way he handled it, you know, you take your cue from the leader. And he was great in moments of adversity. And that inspired the whole group.
One of the elements many people feel were responsible for his ascension, his rapid ascension, his eventual victory in 2008 was people would just sense looking at him, never mind just looking at him, but hearing him and following him and what he said and how he said it, that this man was different, that this man was truly different from any other candidate that we had seen in our lifetime, perhaps since 1960. And when he was elected to the United States Senate in 2004, he indicated several times on the record that he would not be a candidate for president in 2008, that he would serve his full term in the United States Senate. His administrative assistant running his Senate office was a man named Pete Rouse, who worked for years for Tom Daschle, the former Senate Majority Leader who lost his seat in the fall of 2004. Daschle is a terrific guy. Pete Rouse is a terrific guy. And then Senator Obama told Pete Rouse, don't worry, stay with me, stay as running the Senate office because you won't have to worry about me running for president. Right. It's not going to happen. Right. In late 2006, early 2007, Pete Rouse wrote a memo to Senator Obama outlining
2005, 2006.
People he ought to meet with in his travels for a potential run for president. And the president, soon to be president, said this makes sense. Shortly thereafter, he went on Meet the Press for not the first time. Right. And Tim Russert asked him point blank.
Played the tape of him saying he wasn't going to run.
Yeah, and he said, I'm not running. Did that bother you at all?
No.
I will not run.
He said that in 2005, and he said that in January of 2006. When he went on Meet the Press, I think it was October 17th, 2006.
Yeah, that was.
And then
yeah.
Tim played the tape for him and said, "Is
Yeah.
that still your position?"
No, he said it
And
changed
he
his
said,
mind.
and he said, "No, I have to say that I'm
Looking at it.
I'm looking at it." And Tim, of course, said afterwards, he said, "No one's ever done that before, where he just fessed up."
But in the interim, before you get to the
Well, let me
fall,
just say this.
did it bother you?
No. Here's what happened. It really was the God's honest truth, and I can attest to it because I had made plans to sit out the 2008 election. I had worked for Hillary, I had worked for John Edwards, I had worked for Tom Vilsack, I had worked for Chris Dodd. All of them were running for president, and I said to them and everyone else that the only thing that would cause me to not sit it out would be as if Barack ran, and he's not going to run. And I was talking to a friend of mine, Jim O'Shea, who at that time was the editor of the LA Times, about writing about the campaign in 2008. I told the people in my firm I was probably going to take a sabbatical in 2008. I really believed he wasn't going to run, and so did everyone else. Now, what happened was in 2005, we were trying to keep our heads down, stayed off of national television, and then Katrina happened. And a lot of attention focused on him in that period of time. He made a speech on Iraq that got a lot of attention, and things started to build. He kept getting invitations to Democratic events from people who didn't want to offend those who were running for president, and so they thought he would be a star attraction and the other candidates wouldn't mind. He got one from Bill Nelson in Florida to come at the end of the year. And it was on a weekend, and he had been on the road quite a bit in the campaign, and we thought he wouldn't want to go. And Robert said, "Before I turn this down," and Obama said, "No, I think we should go. Let's just test." So that was the first indication to us that maybe he was rethinking this. And then Rouse wrote that memo and said, if you're even giving it a little bit of thought, then we ought to build out your schedule so you can meet some people in as you're moving around in 2006. And he said this makes sense. But the real, some things happened. Harry Reid called him in the spring of 2006 and said you ought to think about running with Chuck Schumer. That made an impact on him because here were two fairly senior Democrats who felt that he could. And then, and there were things that we did that no doubt helped create some momentum. He went on his trip to Africa in the summer of 2006. That became
Back
a
home.
major advance. Yes, exactly. Back to his birthplace in Kenya.
Yeah.
And then he wrote a book called The Audacity of Hope that came out in the fall, and that gave that occasion to book tour, crowds. Actually, this is a great crowd, but his crowds were bigger than this, much, and people were just urging him to run. So there was a lot so in the summer, at the end of the summer of 2006, he said, we got to take a look at this. And we started quietly doing some soundings in Iowa,
So when
New
did he
Hampshire.
tell you? When did he tell you, just he and you, when did he tell you, I'm going to do this?
He didn't tell me until, I think it was January 2nd of 2007. Now, by that time, I was pretty certain he was going to do it, but we met several times after the election in 2006, and he set in motion a lot of tasks for all of us. Mine was to write a sort of a memo on strategy and message. Pluff was to do the organizational stuff and work with Rouse on that. And so he wanted to answer the question, could he, if he wanted to, was it even achievable to run? And he wanted to work through whether it was, Michelle asked him in one of these, there were only 8 people in these discussions. That was the entire Obama for America organization nationally. 8 of us in my conference room, and 2 of them were Barack and Michelle, so it was actually just 6. But she said to him, well, what can you offer? What are you going to bring that someone else couldn't bring? And he said, there are a lot of ways to answer that, but he said, 2 things I know. He said, when I raise my hand and take that oath, the world's going to look at us differently. And he said, and I think there are millions of kids in this country who are going to look at themselves differently. But they went off to talk about it. She was not enthused about it at the beginning, and they went off to Hawaii. And he came back, and he came walking into my office on January 2nd. He had just gotten back. He was just unannounced, with his White Sox cap. And
In Chicago.
In Chicago. And he plopped down. We talked for 2 hours about this. And I'd written a memo to him saying I thought it actually was a good time for him to run and why I thought he could win. And I write about that quite a bit in this book. But I said to him then, that my concern for him wasn't that he would win, whether he was going to win. My concern, or whether he was going to lose, my concern was that he was going to win, and that this was going to change his life in ways that he had no concept, and that the campaign itself was going to be something that he had no particular concept of, just the difficulty of it. And I finally said to him, my concern is that I'm not sure you're pathological enough to run for president. So, I know some of these other people, and they're going to drag themselves out of bed at 4 in the morning, no matter what, because they have to be president. And I said, I don't sense that you have to be president. And he said, the truth is, that's when he said, no, you're right. It turns out being Barack Obama is a pretty good gig. He said, and I like my I love being with my family. I like watching ESPN with my friends. I like watching games. I don't, all of that is true. He said, but if you're going to do public service, then do it at the highest level you can so that you can have the biggest impact. And he said, I'm very competitive, and I definitely knew that. Reference back to him taking money from people by playing with his body guy golf. But he said, I'll find it. But for 6 months into that campaign, he was miserable and just not a very good candidate. Really. People don't remember that. I mean, he delivered some good speeches, but by and large, he had a real struggle. And the cognoscenti in Washington were sort of writing him off. We had this Iowa First strategy, so we spent 83 days in Iowa in 2007, and we were like, the gap in the national polls was growing, and people were writing us off, and donors who are always generous, not just with their money, but their thoughts, were suggesting maybe he needed a change of leadership in the campaign. And I mean, it took some time for us to find our sea legs in that.
We're rapidly running into question and answer session here, so I just have a few questions.
Yeah.
No more than 15 or 20-minute answers would be helpful. But are you surprised at how the office of the presidency wears on a person, ages a person?
Well, I've always I said
once you were
this.
in there?
I very quickly learned when I was there that to respect anybody who ever sat in that office and anybody who worked around them, because it is an incredibly difficult job. I mean, the president always says, anything that comes to this desk is impossible, because if it's not, it gets solved somewhere else. But the serial kinds of crises that you have to deal with on a daily basis, some of which people never even know about, is just mind-boggling, and the amount of material you have to absorb, and the heavy weight of responsibility. And when we got there, obviously we were in the midst of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Larry Summers told us 1 in 3 chance of a second Great Depression. So we were like a triage unit every day trying to save the economy. We had 2 wars, 180,000 troops in harm's way. And then the things you don't even, we never really prepped for pirates during the campaign. And now he has 10 minutes to decide whether to authorize the SEALs to take a shot and try and save Captain Phillips, and being told that they're on bobbing water and they could end up killing him. I mean, this is what presidents live with moment to moment. So am I surprised that it ages and wears them so much? No. What I'm surprised is that they hold up as well as they do.
The first 12, 14, 16, 2 years actually of the presidency, a lot of it was consumed with health care. Do you think that the entire process from start to finish, and it's still not finished, of enacting the health care legislation that was enacted would have been made easier had Ted Kennedy lived?
Without question. I think a lot of things, and I would say this whether Vicki was sitting in the front row or not, a lot of things would have been easier if Ted Kennedy had been there, because he was the bridge, he was the glue, he was the guy who got people there in times when it seemed impossible to find common ground, and he engendered so much respect. That's what we heard in this room at his memorial service, that people were willing to go farther, than they otherwise would have. So, yes, it would have been easier, but it also, I will say, it was in many ways his inspiration that caused the president to keep going when many people wanted him to stop. And now you've jeopardized the whole deal, because this is not going to be a 10-second answer or even a 10-minute answer. Take the rest of the night off. I was not for doing health care, and that was a painful thing for me, because I have a very personal reason to understand how the healthcare system needed reform and why it needed reform. Because when I was a young reporter, my first child was born, Lauren, 7 months old. She started having seizures, and we found her blue and limp in her crib. We thought she had died. We took her to the hospital, rushed her to the hospital, and saw her have the first of what would be thousands of grand mal seizures. And they told us it would be done, she'd probably be okay in a day or two, and they released us a month later. She's still having 10 seizures a day. This went on for almost 19 years, and I was making 38. I don't know what they were paying folks, big-time columnists at the Boston Globe at the time, but for us peons at the Tribune, us foot soldiers, I was making $38,000, and I was paying $10,000 a year out of pocket, because we couldn't. Her insurance didn't cover her medications. We couldn't switch insurance because she had a pre-existing condition. So I didn't need a tutorial on the problems of the healthcare system, but I also knew that 7 presidents had tried, 7 presidents had failed. We were in the midst of all this other stuff, and I had real reservations. And he said, look, I get all that, but if we don't get this done in the first 2 years, we won't get it done. And if we don't get it done, this healthcare system is going to continue to corrode and implode, and you're going to have millions of more people uninsured, more and more weight on governments, businesses, families. He said, what are we supposed to do, put our approval rating on the shelf and admire it for 8 years, or are we supposed to draw down on it to try and get something done? And so after that, I was enlisted, and every time we hit a bump in the road, he would, I went in with polling data, and I wasn't trying to get him to stop. By that time, I was totally invested, but I wanted to tell him we were taking on water in the summer of 2009. And he said, yeah, but I just got back from Green Bay, and I met a woman 36 years old with 2 children, a husband. They have health insurance, but she has stage 4 breast cancer, and now she's hit her lifetime cap, and she's worried that she's going to die and leave her family bankrupt. By now, I felt him like his hand in my back, leading me out of his office. And he said, this isn't the country that we believe in, so let's keep on fighting. And then later that summer, some were arguing that we should throw in the towel. He said to Phil Shalero, our legislative director, well, what do you think? Do you think we could pass this bill? And he said, well, it depends how lucky you feel, Mr. President, which isn't necessarily what you want to hear if you're the president. And Obama just smiled at him and said, Phil, I'm a black guy named Barack Obama, and I'm president of the United States. He said, I feel lucky every day. So on the night that it passed, we were in the Roosevelt Room at the White House, adjacent to his office, and my office was right next to his. And we were all in there, the president, the vice president, senior staff. Everybody worked on the issue, and the final votes were coming in, and it was a really momentous occasion. And I got up sort of involuntarily, went into my office, and I closed the door. And Mike, I broke down, and I cried, and I sobbed, and I was trying to figure out why I was reacting this way. And I realized that this is that because of what the president had done, because of what we had done to help him, that other people wouldn't have to go through what my family had gone through. And I went to find him, and I said, Mr. President, I want to thank you on behalf of all those families who won't have to go through what my family went through. And he's a good friend, and he knew what my family had been through. And he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, that's why we do the work. And I'll never, ever forget that, because to me that, in a certain way, encapsulates everything I believe about public service. That's why you do the work. It's not about winning elections. As he said the next morning, he said, I was more excited last night than I was the day I won the election. He said, that's just the semifinals, he says, but this is what it's all about, the chance to do something that's really meaningful. Yes, it would have been easier. We missed Ted Kennedy every day, and we would have prospered from his counsel, and we would have prospered from his ability to bring people together. But I think we honored him by following through and getting the job done.
Why don't we... There are two microphones here, so you can line up and take a shot at David before you line up.
He wants to see if you get me to give shorter answers.
I got to tell you one story. You know presidents and popes and prime ministers. I know two of the briefers who went to Chicago on a cold December morning to give the president-elect his first full briefing as President of the United States, his first full intelligence briefing, with every covert operation the United States was involved in listed around the world. And they arrived the night before the briefing was to begin. I think the briefing was scheduled for like 9 o'clock in the morning in a very secure facility in the federal building where you couldn't hear, tap, anything. And Rod Blagojevich was arrested at 7:30 that morning.
Yes.
And so they had to delay the briefing. And they had a code name for the briefing, and it was Operation HS. And the president-elect arrived in the room. I don't think you were with them.
No.
And the briefers were there with the then head of the CIA, General Mike Hayden, and they slid the book across. The book was like that. And the president opened the binder, looked at it, looked up at them, at the three of them, and said, "Holy shit."
Yeah.
And Operation HS.
You know, a week later, and I promise I'm going to get to you guys. A week later, literally a week later from that day, we had a meeting of the economic advisors, which was equally grim. And he got the Christy Romer, deepest since the Great Depression, Larry Summers, 1 in 3 chance of a Great Depression, Tim Geithner, the banks are locked up, it might collapse, Orzag, it's going to add trillions to the deficits and so on. And Obama said, well, I guess it's too late to ask for a recount. He said, so we'd better figure out what we're going to do here. So yeah, no, being president is we think you get a great plane, you get a great house, you're famous, you get to meet cool people. I don't know. It's a very, very tough job.
David.
Yes.
Thank you very much for sharing your love and admiration of our wonderful president.
Thank you.
Maybe you could help me understand why he elicits such negative feelings from Israelis.
Gee, and that question started off so well. Look, let me speak now as not just as someone who worked for Barack Obama, but as the son of a Jewish immigrant and someone who feels very strongly about Israel. I think an element of it is there have been traditional, we had issues with some in the community before the election in 2008, and I think it has to do with some of the strains that had grown up between the African American community and the Jewish community, who were great allies during the Civil Rights Movement, as you remember. So there was some of that we had to beat back. He got 78% of the Jewish vote in that election. But look, and I know, you think about the people who were closest to him, who have been most instrumental in his career. It's like Abner Mikva and Newton Minow. I've helped him, and Rahm was his chief. I mean, it's like, and his value structure, his value system is very much the value system that I grew up with. But he feels strongly, and I think a lot of American Jews do as well, that for Israel to survive and prosper as a Jewish democratic state, we have to resolve this issue with the Palestinians, and there needs to be a two-state solution. And obviously, there's been a lot of tension between him and the government, the current government in Israel, over this question. and now there's the issue of Iran, and which is looked at existential issue for Israel. Everybody understands that. But what I've learned about foreign policy questions, and it's the one I think you have to ask everybody who enters into these debates, and I want to ask that of all the Republican candidates for president now who are full of bluster, what next? When you take one step, what next? Barack Obama had the prescience to know in 2002 what questions to ask about what next if we invade Iraq. The question on Iran is, it's not ideal. No agreement's going to be ideal, but what is the alternative to an agreement? The best agreement we can get, the most enforceable agreement we can get. And I always ask this question. I was with Karl Rove last Monday in an audience, and I asked him this question. What is the alternative? And you never get an answer because the alternative very likely is war. And war that won't necessarily end, but will actually accelerate the nuclear program in Iran. But this is not the position of the Prime Minister of Israel on this question. So there have been these differences. So I think that's part of it. But I will say that we got 78% of the Jewish vote in 2008. He got a large, probably 8% less in 2012, but still an overwhelming majority. So I'm proud of the fact that the Jewish community, the mainstream Jewish community in this country has been very supportive of the president.
Yes, sir.
You gentlemen both have a wonderful way of words, so much so that I think, Mr. Axelrod, you must have some Irish blood in you. I wonder, do you feel that in this election right now, there'll be as much hatred as there was in the last two? You see all that crap going around for months and months and months.
Well, I mean, I think underlying that question is, was there some special animus reserved for the president because he was African American? Carol's sitting here. She asked me a question in 2007 at a briefing in Chicago as to something was the Bradley effect. Tom Bradley had run for governor of California, and he performed under the polls because at the end there were ostensibly white voters who didn't want to admit that they weren't going to vote for him. And I assured her that I didn't think we were going to see that effect, and we really didn't see it. But there's no doubt. I wrote in the book that race. I never said when I worked for the president that he was the subject of hatred that was generated or opposition generated by race, and I didn't do it because I didn't want to appear to be making an alibi for opposition. And I know that Bill Clinton, for example, had virulent opposition. George W. Bush had virulent opposition. But the truth is, no other president has seen his citizenship persistently challenged. No other president has had a member of Congress stand up in the chamber and shout, "You lie." There has been special animus reserved for him, and
Give him a little postcard, a little snippet of information on what happened when he opened up a Twitter account last week. A Twitter account. At POTUS, hi, I'm Barack, I'm on Twitter now. And at last count, I think the Secret Service had personally gone to people's homes, offices, investigated over 300 people who had made threats on their Twitter account, and the vast, I don't know if it was the vast majority, but a majority of the responses were fueled by race.
I mean, the fact is that race has plagued us as an issue from the beginning of the Republic, and the notion that we were going to kind of eradicate all of that with the election of an African-American president just isn't right. And look, I think there are a lot of people in this country who, not a lot, but there are people in this country who are uncomfortable with the fact that we are becoming a more diverse country. As I mentioned earlier, I'm an immigrant. I think one of the great things about America is that we attract people from all over, and who come here because, like my father did, because this was a place where you could live freely, practice your faith freely, pursue opportunity as far as your efforts would take you, and so on. I think, and the people who come have helped build this country, and that's going to continue to be the case moving forward. So I think it's a strength, but there are people who feel threatened by that, and Barack Obama is a symbol of that for some of those folks. So you see some of that virulence. But let me just say this, lest you believe that the absence of Barack Obama will make this an exercise in mutual admiration. You weren't the guy who asked the question, so. He's looking at me bewildered. He said, what did I do?
Go ahead.
That's not going to happen. I mean, our politics is very coarse right now, but I think there is an element that we saw in 2008 and 2012 that we won't, that may be slightly less virulent.
When Barack Obama leaves office, where will he retire to? Will he retire to Illinois or Hawaii or stay in Washington, D.C.?
Well, we were
Kenya.
we were pleased that he just announced that the Obama Center, the Obama Library, will be located on the south side of Chicago, and the foundation will be there. I think that means that he'll be spending quite a bit of time there. Where they ultimately will spend most of their time, I really don't know, and I don't think they've made a final decision on that yet. Chicagoans are very hopeful that he'll come home, but I think he'll spend quite a bit of time there.
Yes, sir.
In today's New York Times, Thomas Friedman has a column which I believe is brilliant, and I believe the views he expresses in it are the views that motivate Obama in his policy for the Middle East. If that's true, would you please send an email to John McCain and ask him to read it and shut up? Now, if I may, one brief question, and you can answer this in either your New York accent, I'm a New Yorker,
Yes.
or your Brooklyn accent.
Yes.
You spent a lot of time in the White House, but if you were invited tomorrow to visit the White House, what is the one thing you must do?
Show them your identification. They insist on that.
The answer I've gotten
No.
from a few people I've asked is show up, even if you're the quarterback for the New England Patriots.
Listen, there wasn't a day that went by when I worked there that I didn't walk in there with a sense of awe and knowing what has transpired in that building. So, I mean, anybody who has a chance to go there should go. And by the way, this, every once in a while, a sports team gets invited to celebrate championships.
Not the White Sox.
No. Well, the Cubs. I don't know if they were invited in 1908 when was the last time that they won a championship. But occasionally some member of the team will not come because they're, and that happened to George W. Bush as well. I think anybody who gets invited to the White House should go to the White House, and anybody, I don't.
Yes, sir.
First, I'd like to thank you for your 40 years of service.
Thank you.
And the extraordinary work in a campaign to get
Thank
president elected. I'm tall. So my real thing is that one, I worked on the 2012 election in Youngstown, Ohio.
Yeah.
And we outperformed supposedly 2008.
Yes.
So I would like to
thank you
so much for that opportunity, because had you not won
thank you
in
for
08.
doing the hard work.
And then the other thing is that in 2008, coming up will be the 7th year anniversary in June. My younger brother was killed in the Iraq War, and I was asked I had asked John Kerry to speak at the funeral he did, and I was able to have long conversations with some of his staffers. And at the time, they asked me to go and work for the senator that was running for president. They said, you would really enjoy this. Go. It was too close. It was in June and in 08. So in 2012, I on a limb, I sent a resume to the online server or whatever. But I'm from Taunton, so maybe David Seamus helped me out or something like that. But so I get hired, and people keep on asking me, why am I in Ohio? Why am I here? You're from Massachusetts. Why would you go to Ohio to re-elect this president? And I told them I am incredibly thankful. I'm thankful for the health care bill because it has helped so many people, but especially for bringing home those troops. People lose sight of the fact that we are no longer losing people American citizens
Yeah.
overseas right now in Iraq. There were going, like you had said, we knew that there was going to be sectarian violence.
Right.
This wasn't the. So thank you so much for that. And that's not really a question. My question is, in 2010, the midterm elections, the rise of the Tea Party, how did that affect the president? Because it's still there, and it's incredibly hateful. I also ran for office, and I ran against a Massachusetts Tea Party person, and they use incredibly hateful tactics. And I'm sorry, it's not partisan, but that is a group in the partisan politics that is using these Obama is from Kenya, or just lies to get elected. And how did that affect the president's view on politics?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all,
before he answers, could you just tell us your brother's name and how
Yeah.
old he was?
So my brother was Sergeant Shane Duffy. He was 22 years old, 18 days before his 23rd birthday. He was Army Infantry 10th Mountain Division in Iraq. That's where he was pronounced. And his daughter was born on September 11th the year before. He was able to stay home to see her. He came home on Memorial Day weekend, and he was there. He was killed 5 days afterwards on June 4th when he went back. He was stop lost. A lot of people don't know what that is, but he was. And I'm very proud of my brother.
As you
I'm
should
very
be.
proud of everybody that has served. But at the same time, I think it is important to realize what we are fighting for and what are the consequences of these actions. And someone had brought up John McCain, which I really, prior to his 2008 campaign, I had respected him. But as you see, it's a lot of fear-mongering and how many wars would John McCain have had us in by now?
Well, let me just say on behalf of everybody in this room how much we grieve for your loss and honor your brother and your family's sacrifice. So, and I will tell you, you talk about the presidency, Mike, and in a way it leads up to your question. The only time that I've ever really seen the president, deeply depressed was when he had to make calls to families who had lost their loved ones. And he made the decision to send additional troops to Afghanistan. He announced that at West Point. And he knew that some of those young people who were greeting him when he jumped down into the pit would lose their lives because of the order he just gave. Every president lives with that, and it's an awful realization because behind every one of those kids is a story just like the one you told, and so I do get. I mean, John McCain has served this country in awesome and incredible ways, made huge sacrifices, but it does cause you to say, we ought to ask what's next and not commit these young lives without a clear plan and understanding of what it is that we're going to accomplish by sending them. And so in terms of how he felt about the midterm election, we had seen some of this. His concern about the midterm elections were, he called me that night and he asked me about specific members of Congress, most of them young members of the House, Patrick Murphy in Pennsylvania, and a number of others who,
Seth Moulton
John
from
Bocherry,
Massachusetts.
yes, John Bocherry in Ohio, a number of them who he really had a high regard for, and he was really, really sad that they had lost. But the next morning he came in and he said, look, everybody was hanging crepe on the White House, and he said, we got things we have to do. We have a lame duck session here, and I've got this list of things we got to get done. And everybody was looking at him like, what? Did you not read the newspaper? Do you not know what happened? And you know, we got most of the stuff done that he wanted to get done. Again, it is that quality to be able to bounce back. Now, I will tell you that I said to him the day after, I think the seeds of your reelection have just been planted. And he looked at me like I was nuts. You know, there's that story about Lady Clementine saying to Winston Churchill after he lost in 1946, after leading Britain through the war, she said, "This is a blessing in disguise." And he said, "Well, it's rather well disguised." And I think Obama was having a hard time seeing his way to my point. But I felt that this group that had taken control of the Republican Party was going to force the nominee in 2012 to pay a very high toll to get that nomination. It was going to make that nominee, it was going to make it very difficult for that nominee to win a general election, and I think that that is part of the history of 2012. And one of the questions for 2016 is, can the nominee resist some of the more strident voices of in that party? You know, I know Governor Bush is trying on immigration reform and so on. I think the ability to do that is going to say a lot about their ability to win a national election.
Peter Flaherty can answer that
Yes.
after. But
Peter Flaherty, a great guy who worked for Governor Romney and can probably attest to some of that, had to deal with some of that himself.
we only have time for one more question. Okay? Sorry, go ahead. I'd answer your question later.
Actually, the culmination of your political career probably came last month in the UK with the resounding victory of David Cameron. The same type of spin techniques that you use to sell a completely foul and phony progressive like Obama to the American public with his NSA national security
Where's the kid
state.
with the question?
Didn't.
Hey, come on up here. Seriously. Come on.
Yeah, this is what you get with Obama. They cut you off and they don't allow you to even ask any critical questions
Listen,
about him.
someone's
With his
in the-
terrorist drone campaigns,
Excuse me.
didn't work too well in the UK, did they?
Excuse me. Someone's upset with
Can
their
I just say,
drive-through order.
sir,
Please go out and
before
take
you
care of
sit
it.
down, I didn't work for David Cameron. I worked for the opposition.
That's why I said he got a resounding victory thanks to your help with.
Oh, I see. I see.
Go ahead. What's your question?
Thank you very much for your time and for the opportunity to ask a question. Okay. My question is a little bit about one of the criticisms I've heard of President Obama is that in his sort of private time, if any exists in the White House, maybe he didn't spend enough time building relationships with members of Congress. So I guess the question I have is a two-part one. The first one, do you think that's fair? Do you think that's a legitimate criticism? And number two, if it is true, do you think that it was in spending time with his family that maybe allowed him to remain sane, allowed him to remain...
Really good question.
Thank you.
I think both things are true. I think that he had made an ironclad commitment to himself and to Michelle that he was going to be home for dinner every night that he was in Washington. He didn't do a lot of socializing. He's always said he was going to leave Washington with the same friends he came with, and he has a lot of good friends who he spent a lot of time with. He has done social things with members of Congress and so on. But I think I told you what my critique was earlier. Sometimes I think he's a little less tolerant of politicians being politicians, than he should be, and I think that's hurt from time to time. But I don't think that's the major part of the story. I think the major part of the story was that we won this resounding victory in 2008, swept in large majorities in both houses of both chambers, and I think the Republicans made a strategic decision. They knew we were going to have to make some really difficult decisions to deal with this economic crisis. They knew the crisis wouldn't abate very quickly, and they felt that their best strategy was to let us fend with all of these issues on our own and run against us on the decisions we had to make. Now I honor him for the decisions he made. I remember when they called his decision to intervene to save the American auto industry socialism. But I just read the other day that Chrysler canceled their summer vacation because they had to keep manufacturing cars. Chrysler wouldn't be here today but for that, I think that could we have done better? Probably so. Would it have made a big difference? I'm very doubtful about that. very doubtful about that because I think there was a strategic decision on the part of the Republican Party. Mitch McConnell's been very blunt about that. And from the standpoint of sheer kind of strategy, wasn't a bad judgment. From the standpoint of what the country needed, it was a kind of a shameful judgment.
David, at each of these events, each of the guests, each of the speakers is asked to speak to the memory of John F. Kennedy and the impact that John F. Kennedy had on the speaker, had on you. And if you can think back to that day when you were 5 years of age at that rally in Stuyvesant Town.
This is where my book begins because this was sort of the seminal event of my childhood relative to the rest of my life. JFK was coming to Stuyvesant Town. It was, as Heather mentioned, 12 days before the 1960 election, which shows you how long ago it was that a Democrat was campaigning in New York 12 days before an election. But it was a very close election. New York was a swing state at the time. And he was coming to Stuyvesant Town. It was one of his 10 stops that day in the afternoon. And the woman who took care of me when my mother was at work was this African-American woman, wonderful woman named Jessie Berry. Classic story had come up in the Great Migration, very little formal education, but great wisdom. And she thought I should see this, and she took me out and she put me on top of a mailbox. And I watched 20th Street, which was usually filled with cars, fill in with people. And this red-haired young man jumped up on a platform, and everybody was transfixed by what he was saying, and his voice was booming off of the high-rise buildings. And I don't want to push this to the point that I would claim that I remember from that moment what he said. But through the wonders of Google, which nobody could have imagined that day, I learned what he said, and what he said was, I'm not here on the platform that says, if you elect me, everything will be good. He said, being an American citizen in the 1960s is a hazardous occupation filled with peril, but also with hope, and we'll decide which path we take. And that really kind of frames my view of what politics at its best is all about. It's our chance to choose that path. And his brother, Robert, said, it's the epigram of my book, said the future's not a gift, it's an achievement. And I think that's what the Kennedys taught us, that we need to work for that future that we want, that it's not a gift. And that's what public service and that's what politics should be all about. So I'm here, and I'm in awe of these surroundings because I'm not the only person who was inspired by John Kennedy, by Robert Kennedy, by Ted Kennedy to pursue careers in politics and public service. And I'm just grateful to have the opportunity to be sitting here.
We will leave you with one Jack Kennedy story that was told to me by Bob Crane, who is the state treasurer here in Massachusetts for 612 years, and who, even with the opposition of the Catholic Church, started the Massachusetts State Lottery. And the story revolves around an appearance here in Boston by the President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, in the fall of 1962. And he came to Boston for a Democratic State Committee fundraising dinner held at the Commonwealth Armory, the old Commonwealth Armory, which is now the BU skating rink up in Commonwealth Avenue. The candidates for statewide office that year were Frank Bellotti running for governor, Frank Bellotti running for lieutenant governor, Chub Peabody running for governor. Eddie McLaughlin was a candidate on the ballot that year. I believe he was running for lieutenant governor. Frank Bellotti was running for attorney general. And a young man who had gone to Williams College running for Secretary of State by the name of Kevin White. And Kevin White and Bob Crane told me the following story, that each of the statewide candidates were told that they could do one of two things. They could come to Logan Airport and meet the President of the United States there when Air Force One came in and have their picture taken there with the President of the United States, or they could have their picture taken with the President of the United States at the fundraising dinner at the Commonwealth Armory later that evening. That dinner was a black tie dinner, and they could not do both. So the candidates, including Kevin White, were there. Air Force One lands at Logan Airport. And as Kevin White told me, the President of the United States appeared in the doorway of Air Force One when the doors opened, and Kevin White said, "I thought I was looking at the sun god." He said he was so handsome. He said it was incredible just to be in his presence. The President of the United States bounded down the stairs, and all of the candidates for statewide office, the Democrats, were lined up to shake his hand and have their pictures taken. One of them, Eddie McLaughlin, was in a tuxedo. All of the other candidates were pissed off. But Eddie McLaughlin, whose nickname was Red, was in the Navy in World War II and had a past friendship and association with the President of the United States. And he was first in line. The President of the United States bounds down the stairs, grabs Eddie McLaughlin by the hand, looks at him, steps back and says, "Hey, Red, taking the job kind of seriously, aren't you?" Thank you and good night.